Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture this season by one of our distinguished Whitehead visiting scholars. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, and I thought I would use the sort of Imperial Byzantine purple here for my background, I'm going to bring to your attention the next upcoming lecture, which will be on December 16th. This was a lecture that was postponed from last year because of COVID. And since we wanted an in-person speaker, she agreed to come this year. This is Alexandra Kronkelite, who's going to speak on the German Archaeological Institute and the Nazi Ancestral Heritage Research and Teaching Society, as you can see here. This is the annual archives lecture organized by our Director of Archives, Natalia Volkay-Brogan. So we hope you'll come back in 2 weeks for this lecture. Now tonight it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Teresa Shawcross, who is this year's Elizabeth A. Whitehead Distinguished Scholar. And she's currently teaching a class with our students, a seminar on Byzantine Athens. And we're very delighted to have a Byzantine historian as one of the two Whitehead professors, and that way we can tap into the rich resources on both sides of Swedeas Street. She's currently an associate professor in the history department at Princeton, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on medieval Europe, the Byzantine Empire, the Crusades, Venice, and the Mediterranean world. You can see on the screen her two distinguished publications. Her first book, entitled The Chronicle of Morea, Historiography in Crusader Greece, deals with the Crusader states and the evolving representation of identity in historical narrative. In case you don't know, the Chronicle of the Morea is one of the most important and apparently controversial historical narratives written in the Middle Ages, and it tells the story of the Villehardouin dynasty's formation and governing of what turned out to be a remarkably successful Crusader state in southern Greece following the conquest of Constantinople in 1204. This was published by Oxford in 2009. And in 2018, she published, also with Cambridge, a co-edited book entitled Reading in the Byzantine Empire and Beyond. This is not readings, this is reading, and it provides a very comprehensive introduction to the books, readers, and reading in the Byzantine Empire. Professor Shawcross earned her BA, MPhil, and PhD from the University of Oxford, and her maîtresse from Paris University at the Sorbonne. She's held many distinguished grants and also including a postdoctoral fellowship at Princeton and a research fellowship at Trinity Hall in Cambridge. Previous to her appointment, her recent appointment at Princeton, she taught as an assistant professor of medieval European and Mediterranean history at Amherst College. And we're very pleased tonight to hear her speak on the topic of loving the poor, charity and justice in Byzantine Greece. Professor Shawcross. I should also say that at the end we will have a Q&A as usual, both from this audience, where we will have two roving mics. Just raise your hand, and online questions, because this is being live streamed. So, Professor Shawcross.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for that very generous introduction. And kalispera στους Έλληνες και ελληνόφωνους ακροατές μας. In 1218, John Apokafkos, the Metropolitan of Nafpaktos, wrote to his suffragan, George, the Bishop of Vonitsa, berating him for his reluctance to distribute the produce of his see to those who needed sustenance. Abok, of course, invoked the biblical example of the widow, who, in a time of drought and famine, had just enough for one last meal for herself and her child, yet, when asked, willingly shared what she had. The bishop, by contrast, had stockpiled substantial quantities of food, but when beseeched for some olive oil, shamelessly directed the suppliant to a storage jar, which contained only the faintest glimmer of oil at the bottom. So little, Abok, of course, reported, that had a mouse let down its tail into the jar, it would not have managed to grease even the tip of the tail. The conduct of another George, the suffragan of Himara, had not proven any better, for that bishop reluctantly provided a crust or two of bread, but no oil at all, let alone any meat or fish. Such sequestering of resources had grave consequences. When inclement weather and a bad local harvest were compounded by crushing imperial taxation, food stocks dwindled, and the parishioners of the Archdiocese of Nafpaktos were condemned to starvation. Incensed though he was with his fellow prelates for withholding aid, Abok, of course, reserved his full ire for the future emperor, Theodore Komnenos, whose policies he blamed for the predicament in which Nafpaktos found itself. He explained that the inhabitants could at most collect together 180 gold coins, far less than the 1,000 the fisc demanded. To try and make up the shortfall, Abok, of course, had been compelled to lay hands on church plate, silk vestments, and clerical mounts. He reminded Komnenos that the Holy Church had a mission to alleviate poverty, and that for this reason its land and revenue were referred to as being for the poor, ptochika. A secular lord who forced a bishop to use ecclesiastical property for other purposes was guilty of sacrilege. Abok, of course, continued, "My indignation knows no bounds when I see the poor who are entrusted to the church being tormented, plundered, and forced to flee for the sake of gold." He warned that, if his words were not heeded, the Lord of vengeance, who does not forget the poor, shall give his verdict, smiting those who wrong the poor. He underscored his point by sending a poor man to demand of Komnenos' treasurer that the emperor stump up the requisite aid, since the needs of the destitute could no longer be met using the church's resources. During the Central Middle Ages, the economy of the Byzantine Empire was radically transformed as a result of the integration of the Mediterranean within expanding global networks of trade. By the 11th century, shifts in production, distribution, and finance, together with increased urbanization and migrations of rural populations, had begun to create unprecedented opportunity for the accumulation of private wealth. But they also destabilized the traditional structures of society, resulting in a rise in the numbers of those who failed to earn a living wage as craftsmen or day laborers, and the creation of new categories of the needy, destitute, and disenfranchised. To this problem were added imperial policies to increase fiscal revenue from the provinces, the introduction of extra taxes in order to defend the state and its institutions from the armies of Frankish and Turkic expansion, aimed to cream off the lay fortunes recently built on manufacturing and trade. But provincials acquiring and managing these fortunes had no desire to fund conflicts that did more to disrupt than to protect mercantile incentives. They found ways to hide their money. This meant that the fiscal burden fell disproportionately on those, such as agricultural workers, whose less innovative endeavors remained visible to tax collectors. Into this crisis stepped the figure of the bishop, stretching out his hands to unite rich and poor within a system of evietism and patronage. The idea that relieving the suffering of the poor, weak, and defenseless was among prelates' paramount duties was not, of course, new. Indeed, its origins could be traced back to the early church. Nonetheless, the second half of the 12th and early 13th centuries saw a dramatic surge of references in churchmen's writings and speeches to the distribution of charity. These references were increasingly accompanied by an emphasis on the role of the bishop's court tribunal in hearing disputes and providing justice. The promotion of the episcopate as the main source, not only of almsgiving, but also of legal redress, was a feature primarily of the western provinces of the empire. Asiatic bishops were often titular, residing in the capital. The interior of the eastern provinces had largely been lost to invasion, while even the situation on the Anatolian coast was precarious. In the southern Balkans, by contrast, the church had undergone substantial reorganization, resulting in greater dynamism and adaptability. Crucially, although bishops were educated in the imperial capital and were meant to be appointed by the emperor, episcopal interests did not necessarily coincide with those of the secular imperial administration. The bishop's status depended on their ability to present themselves as the primary protectors of the local population. But, as we shall see, these populations also began over time to assert their own fierce sense of agency. The power of bishops in the provinces would end up being undermined by the emergence of modes of giving and legal frameworks that fed an economy of beneficence focused on civic ideals. Let us trace these momentous changes in greater detail. In the 11th and early 12th centuries, the ecclesiastical establishment had been wont to declare itself incapable of fighting the provincial poverty caused by the state's predatory activities. The routine oppression of dioceses by tax collectors was said to have discouraged clerics from taking up or keeping episcopal appointments. The bishop of Amyklion in the Peloponnese resigned on account of the violence of the praetor. Likewise, the autocephalous bishop of the island of Cyprus was forced by a praetor to become a monk. Yet another cleric, when offered the see of Corinth, was so disconcerted by reports of the archdiocese's limited resources that he simply turned down the appointment. He was then offered the see of Ephesus instead, which he did take up, only to regret the decision almost immediately, writing back to his friends at the Patriarchate to complain about the dilapidated state of his archdiocese and elicit their sympathy regarding the squalid conditions he encountered on a daily basis when trying to discharge his pastoral duties. One of the abdicating prelates, Nicholas Musalon, who had abandoned his see in 1111, had written a highly dramatic poem about the circumstances that had led him to such a desperate course of action. In the work, he had set out the anguished debate he'd had with himself before reaching the decision to hand in his notice. He had explained that, although he had tried his best to look after his flock, conditions on the ground had rendered it impossible for him to do so. Heavy imperial taxation had ravaged Cyprus. Most of the local inhabitants were poor and destitute. The land was fertile and capable of producing an abundant harvest, but fiscal officials had already siphoned off all the products of the farmers' labor and were employing violence in order to try and extract still more. Not only did the state flog and hang those who were in arrears, but it forced their compatriots to stand surety for them and either contribute the shortfall or face punishment in turn. Although the archbishop told himself he ought to continue to fight, he could bear it no longer. He had come to the realization that he simply did not have sufficient funds available to make a perceptible difference. He felt guilty for giving up, but believed he had no choice. A solution could not be found to his flock's predicament unless his archdiocese was provided with suitable support for its ministry. When tending his personal resignation, Musalon had proposed a remedy to the situation he and his peers had encountered. This was a surrender to the church of a larger proportion of the provincial revenues of the empire. and the decision to allow bishops to choose how these revenues should be used to benefit the population. The reiterated claims of ecclesiastics like Musalon that they lacked the means to perform their social mission did for a time lead the ruling Komneni to bolster the position of the provincial church. Certainly the early Komnenian emperors Isaac I and Alexios I had taken steps to augment the income of the church by demanding compulsory payment to bishops of an annual tithe, a basic contribution known as a canonicon. They had also determined the supplementary sums bishops could collect in fees for ordinations, marriages, baptisms, and funerals, as well as in fines assessed for moral transgressions. John II, similarly, had been keen to put the provincial ecclesiastical hierarchy of his empire on a sound financial footing, declaring his intention to ensure that the possessions of the Holy Church be spared all vexations and offences and not suffer any harm. John had sought to protect the episcopate during crises, such as the death of a bishop, by decreeing that it was forbidden to seize any wealth from the buildings and land belonging to a metropolis, archbishopric, or bishopric. Any imperial officials or other lords or their subordinates who attempted to disobey these orders were required to pay heavy compensation. These actions appear within decades to have increased the power of the provincial church to a degree that alarmed the imperial administration. And so, under John's youngest son, Manuel I, policy underwent another shift. Although Manuel had begun his reign by confirming and extending his predecessor's measures, he later proceeded to suspend the flow of munificence, indeed force that flow backwards, so that it returned to him. Seeking to acquire ecclesiastical support in 1143-46, the newly crowned Manuel had made a large donation in gold to the Patriarchate and raised the income of its officers, also granting privileges to monasteries in the greater region of the capital and its hinterland, and to priests throughout the empire. In 1148, he had issued a crucible in which he declared that the immovable property of all provincial churches would be maintained, and indeed strengthened, with titles being confirmed and restitutions being made of land, installations, and laborers, even in cases where documentary proof of ownership was imprecise or faulty. A flurry of benefactions had followed to episcopal sees in their western provinces that included Athens, Corfu, Kruia, Thebes, and Thessalonica. The imperial administration had drawn up inventories of current possessions and privileges, granted further donations and tax exemptions, and issued up-to-date deeds and titles. In 1153 and 1158, these earlier concessions had been extended, with emphasis put on the renunciation by the fisc of all claims on land in ecclesiastical possession. Property was to remain in the hands of the church, even when titles failed to fulfill the criteria of imperial laws and ordinances, or were absent altogether. In a memorandum to an official, the emperor had gone so far as to permit possession by bishops and abbots of lands that had belonged to other notables or peasants or imperial ministries and foundations. Moreover, in order to get around the disapproval of his chancellor of the exchequer, Manuel had chosen not to work through the fiscal bureau, instead assigning to his own private secretary direct responsibility for dispensing payments to the church from the imperial treasury. Towards the end of 1158, however, Manuel changed tack, issuing a crucible that revoked all earlier benefactions to the church. An ordinance was published indicating the emperor's intention to revive 10th century laws in favor of the poor that explicitly restricted clerical and monastic fortunes and set strict limits on the tax exemptions and other privileges of the church. The ecclesiastical establishment was further targeted during the 1160s through a series of imperial edicts that came close to accusing it, and especially its bishops, of obstructing justice. The legislation insisted on the need to abolish all human suffering and, to this end, reorganized the civil courts in the provinces, making them more accessible and efficient. The legal tribunals staffed by imperial officials were to remain open all year round. Deferrals of hearings were to be avoided, and judgments were to be given in a timely fashion so that the provincials are not forced, because of the protracted length of proceedings and the lack of resources, to consider the avoidance of the courts more worthwhile than recourse to them. Manuel presented himself as instituting social justice by ensuring that the rights of all full imperial subjects were equal in the eyes of the law. Manuel and his administration sought to redefine charity, aligning it with a manifestation of imperial justice that was itself presented as a reflection of divine justice. An edict from the 1160s acknowledged that God is served by mercy and pity, but it then quibbled that what had recently passed for these had in fact allowed some subjects to take advantage of legal loopholes to the injury of other subjects. The emperor claimed to implement a truer kind of compassion, making injuries good by right judgment. Manuel insisted that he acted as the main champion of the poor against oppression and suffering through the establishment and implementation of just legislation and a robust judicial process. Many of these late communion policies were extended by the next imperial dynasty of the Angeli. Isaac II Angelos, for example, sought to siphon off to the treasury 2/3 of the fines collectible by the church for offenses against it. These measures could not curb the rise of bishops as figures of authority. One of the most successful prelates of the second half of the 12th century was Michael Choniatis, a skilled administrator and noted intellectual who was elevated in the 1180s to the metropolis of Athens. Invoking the language of pastoral duty that clerics habitually favored, Choniatis drew attention to the plight of the downtrodden and destitute soon after taking up his post. There were, he stated, so very many poor in his archdiocese. However, instead of playing up the powerlessness of the church and insisting he was overwhelmed, as bishops had done earlier in the 12th century in order to appeal to the emperor's generosity, Choniatis adopted a more self-assured tone. Projecting an image of himself as a highly competent and influential leader, a spokesman for the community of us Athenians, he insisted that the Church of Athens was a force to be reckoned with. Pushed to the limits of endurance, the Athenians, he argued, felt that the empire had all but forfeited its legitimacy. There was a real possibility this disaffection with the regime would lead to outright rebellion, perhaps even to a bid for regional independence. Only the church could resolve the crisis, because it alone knew how to succor the indigent as much as possible and avoid being unjust to them without doing damage to the state. The emperor should not expect to achieve anything locally, Choniatis intimated, without the bishop's collaboration and support. Choniatis repeatedly named and shamed those within the imperial administration whom he accused of being destroyers of the poor. Blaming Constantinople for bleeding the provinces dry, he gave the delicate residents of the capital a dressing down for being willfully oblivious to the suffering of others. "What do you lack?" he asked them. "The fertile fields of corn in Thrace and Macedonia and Thessaly feed you. Euboea, Kos, Chios, and Rhodes provide you with wine. In Thebes and Corinth, fingers weave garments for you. All the rivers of riches flow to the city of Constantine, as real rivers to the sea." Was this how the deep channels of imperial philanthropy were supposed to irrigate Athens with charity? He listed the depredations Athenians suffered at the hands of various tax collectors, who came collecting not simply the tax for the navy, but also the hearth tax, the land tax, and endless other taxes. Multiple times in one year, Attica had become a vale of tears, ravaged by hunger and thirst, as a result of the confiscation of their produce and the destruction of their fields, its inhabitants were left with only wails and lamentations to sustain them. Attica had not, Choniates declared, received fair treatment, let alone aid. Choniates reminded officials that while they claimed to govern in accordance with vaunted Byzantine laws that would bring peace and justified high levels of tax collection by pretending that the funds went toward local security, they in fact did not maintain an effective military defense, instead allowing imperial citizens to suffer repeated raids. This behavior, the bishop argued, made the emperor's assertions to protect all the lands under Byzantine authority increasingly unconvincing. Athenians were forced to question whether Attica, desiring to be treated in accordance with the laws of justice and legitimate authority, should be considered an imperial possession. It is up to you, Choniates admonished the first minister of the empire, to decide through the actions you take whether this region should be numbered any longer among the lands under imperial rule. Such warnings were not meant idly. They strongly hinted that notions were being entertained in southern Greece, similar to those that had already cost the empire portions of coastal Asia Minor and the Western Balkans. Constantinople took the threat seriously and placated the bishop and his flock. The immunity from taxation enjoyed by the cathedral and its estates appears to have been extended to the entire Athenian fiscal district, which included the walled city and probably also the burg and wider surroundings. As a result of concessions made by the central administration, Athens possessed a significant measure of independence by the end of the 12th century, with its privileges and exemptions being recorded in a crucible, signed in the emperor's own hand. Within the limits of that district, neither the imperial governor of Hellas and the Peloponnese nor any of his representatives could collect taxes or impose corvées. Moreover, the governor did not possess legal jurisdiction over the district, and his very entry within the walls on any pretext whatsoever was expressly forbidden. By the 13th century, only the word of the metropolitan bishop held sway in the city of Athens. But to what extent did that word come to be considered also to be law? Choniates' surviving letters contain no reference to the operation in his see of an episcopal court, although it is likely such a court did convene and that the metropolitan did render judgment. From the early 13th century onwards, archives from other archdioceses preserved detailed records of the workings of their courts, reflecting an attempt to present the clergy as the most efficacious source of justice to which people could have access. While the impact of foreign invasion and occupation after 1204 cannot be ignored here, records suggest that the expansion of the remit of canon law and the annexation by episcopal courts of much of the business of civil courts had begun significantly earlier. Indicative are the 29 surviving court decisions associated with the tribunal convened by John Abokavkos of Nafpaktos, who was in post from 1199 to 1232. Complaining about the unjust pronouncements of the secular courts, Abokavkos advertised his own knowledge of the law, as well as his will to uphold order by defending the rights of the weak and delivering just verdicts. Most of the cases coming before him involved lay persons. He punished rape, protected girls from being married off below the legal age, annulled marriages that had been contracted as a result of compulsion or deceit, and he approved divorces not only on the grounds of adultery or impotence, but also because of hatred between the two parties. Other cases dealt with property disputes and issues of inheritance, and finally, homicide. The activities of Abokavkos' younger colleague, Dimitris Komatinos, Archbishop of Ohrid, from 1216 to 1236, are preserved in an even more extensive dossier, consisting of some 152 expert opinions, judgments, and penitential rulings. In these, the prelate displayed his training in law, not only by specifying the exact statutory bases of his decisions, but in most cases by quoting them verbatim, a tactic that surely helped boost people's confidence in him. Litigants represented a broad cross-section of society, from the emperor and members of the military aristocracy and lay landowners, to bishops, monks, and members of the clergy, to townsmen, farmers, and peasants. Irrespective of their actual age and social background, the parties that appealed to Chomatinos' justice frequently underscored both their vulnerability and their reliance on ecclesiastical protection. One petitioner introduced himself by emphasizing that his surname was Chamilos, or the lowly one. Another referred to the great prelates whom God had placed in office so that they could protect the vulnerable and right wrongs. I take refuge, the suppliant asserted, addressing Chomatinos, in the mercy of your great holiness, and beg to receive help against the injustices that I have suffered. That these remarks tallied with the episcopal court's own understanding of its role is apparent from the order in which Chomatinos organized his records during his lifetime. His dossier was designed to culminate with an account of cases concerning the weak, humble, and poor. While the episcopal court of Ohrid could have refused to accept requests from petitioners from territories outside its episcopal jurisdiction, Chomatinos became one of the foremost legal arbiters in the southern Balkans. Petitioners declared that everyone had heard of the righteous dispensation of justice over which he presided. Indeed, his tribunals served as the court of final recourse. In one 13-year legal dispute concerning the ownership of a vineyard, the case traveled all the way through the secular courts to the Imperial High Court without resolution, only finally to be decided at Chomatinos' regional ecclesiastical court. This suggests that the archbishop had at his disposal powers of enforcement unavailable to the emperor. If the secular officials of the empire had ceded ground to the ecclesiastical establishment, the latter imposing its authority on judicial matters, the inhabitants of the provinces did not always take kindly to the heavy guiding hand of the bishop. Reactionaries at heart, bishops such as Evstathios of Thessaloniki corresponded with their fellow clerics about the need for a rigid social order. Those communities that did not have guides assigned to them fell prey to that destructive force that was leaderless anarchy. At the dawn of history, according to Evstathios, there may have been no law or rule, but civilization had emerged, with stratification as its distinguishing feature. In any civilized society, there would always be a minority who are numbered among the great, while the majority belonged to the little folk. Furthermore, Evstathios asserted, toil through which man aims to live off his own capabilities without being a burden to others was pleasing to God. Given this, the poor should be hardworking and meekly accept their lot. They should not complain about hunger, cold, and nakedness, but be thankful that physical effort mortifies their bodies, allowing them to fix their minds more easily on the constant hope of the life thereafter. Conversely, the rich and notable should be comforted by the thought that they had been raised above the humble, not by accident, but by divine providence. They would not be damned by the accumulation of wealth, as long as they undertook, by giving of that wealth, to reverse the exploitation which, arising out of laziness, unproductivity, and luxuriousness, uses others' labor in such a way as to degrade them, either by hiring them on a daily wage, or worse still, by imposing on them slavery without payment. Through donations from their hoarded treasure, the rich could expunge their sins and save their own souls, acting in imitation of the ultimate benefactor, God. They would have God's mercy reflected back on them. This treasure's distribution, moreover, was to be entrusted to the church, which alone could identify the most deserving recipients. if such a system of charitable giving, spurred on by mankind's greatest good, love, were practiced throughout the world, Eustathius argued, it would not merely lead to rewards in the hereafter, but would eliminate all the world's current problems. Contention, the mother of war, would have no say, but instead of a multitude of weapons, we would have a glut of plowshares. And councils, laws, and schools would flourish, along with marriages, commerce, and every art and science. Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Such views did not sit well, Eustathius acknowledged, with contemporary reality. In a rapidly growing city such as Thessaloniki, society had become disrupted. Eustathius explained, hardly is there time to proclaim one of our citizens honorable today, before he is tomorrow prescribed as dishonorable and condemned to oblivion. Now he is revered as a rich man, and shortly thereafter he is a pauper. He is noble at one instant in time, but a minute later is accused of descending from a family to be reviled, and is rejected as if he were a slave, which indeed he is now called instead of a free man. Life was like the ever-revolving weather vane that blew on hither and thither. Those who found themselves prospering at a specific moment supported deregulation of social relations, arguing that it was this deregulation that provided opportunity for limitless self-advancement. They considered all to be well, Eustathius lamented, as long as their business interests were not harmed, and they could persevere unhindered in their commercial transactions, increasing their fortune by a few coins. Instead of taking pride in the quality of their merchandise, they conducted those transactions in a manner unchecked by moral concerns, habitually cheating and deceiving their brother in order to maximize profit. According to Eustathius, these merchants were so wholly devoid of scruples that they had the temerity to ask why it was necessary to provide sustenance for the poor, asserting, we too were once poor, and yet have succeeded in prospering without receiving aid from others. To such free thinkers, the Church's ministry to the poor constituted at best a nuisance and at worst a peril. The call for alms, Eustathius wrote, is a heavy sound that grates with the audience, scattering them. The citizens stayed away from religious ceremonies and turned a deaf ear to sermons, refusing to dig into their coffers. They displayed an outright lack of reverence for the ecclesiastical establishment, comporting themselves as cheap philosophers who claim on the one hand to respect and revere the Church and to be her supporters, even to be ready to die for her, and on the other set churchmen and church property at naught, reasoning that everything on earth is incompatible with the divine, and both churchmen and their affairs are earthly. They maintain that God has no need to possess either persons or things. Among us, the great saying is, Eustathius reported of the Thessalonians, what need of material things do God and his saints have, since they themselves neither sow, nor reap, nor eat, nor drink? Bishops could be regarded with extreme suspicion by citizens and become the subject of slanderous campaigns. A defamatory caricature that bore the legend, a malicious man in the guise of the present bishop of Thessaloniki, was doing the rounds in the city, and though Eustathius initially tried to laugh it off as a prank, he trembled at the permanent damage it could do his reputation. The mutterings of his detractors grew so loud that after his death, charges of his having loved wealth and hoarded money had to be rebutted during his funeral elegy. Other prelates faced similar attacks. Even in Athens, Choniatis, although generally more respected by his flock than Eustathius had been, had to respond to charges in 1210 that during his tenure of office, his church had accumulated a vast treasure, which he had then embezzled and was using for his private gratification. In Naupactus too, John Apokafkos was accused in 1217 of misusing church funds. A little later, churchmen in western Greece were perturbed by news of a brash youth in the Archdiocese of Corfu who claimed he had seen a supernatural vision of his metropolitan, George Vardanis, being punished in hell for having abused God's trust on earth. The youth also alleged that he had heard a heavenly voice, promising that before the metropolitan died, he would be forced to distribute to the poor the possessions that he had amassed. Vardanis tried to counter such slander by having the fiscal concessions and other privileges he and his predecessors had secured for the archdiocese from the imperial administration inscribed in stone and erected in public view. This had little effect upon the Corfiots. Some episcopal flocks indeed went beyond mere words. A colleague of Vardanis's, the Bishop George of Himara, who fell into a coma and was given up for dead, discovered, when he unexpectedly regained consciousness, that a good portion of his church's property had been seized and duly dispensed to the common and unruly people and the paupers to whom it was supposed to have been dedicated. So, what sense can we make of these developments? Some words in conclusion. We have sketched an outline of a debate in the Byzantine Empire during the long 12th century about the nature of the impact of wealth, the stratification of imperial society, and the limits of legitimate state action. The period was one of notable economic growth and social mobility for the Western provinces as a result of their greater integration within long-distance commercial networks. The increasingly complex fiscal apparatus through which emperors sought to secure control of their new wealth, of the new wealth being produced by their territories, by collecting it in the public treasury and employing it to defend the secular fabric of the state, was considered overly intrusive and burdensome. In this context, bishops, long entrusted with the moral guardianship of regional communities, advocated for the preservation of wealth within local communities in order to achieve a philanthropic purpose that brought households and neighborhoods closer to the heavenly kingdom. These bishops were able to take advantage of the difficulties the Comnenian dynasty faced when attempting to render their usurping regime legitimate. Although the second half of the 12th century saw emperors responding with a flurry of legislation, championing a heroic notion of social justice, whose implementation was to be achieved through paternalistic oversight by imperial law and imperial tribunals, they were unable to prevent the expansion of ecclesiastical courts as judicial institutions. By the end of the century, indeed, bishops such as Michael Choniatis, the prelate of Athens, could claim considerable autonomy of action as the main administrators and arbiters of provincial life. Yet, as these same bishops realized, the people over whom they asserted their authority could not be counted upon to continue to share unquestioningly in the ecclesiastical establishment's understanding of its mission. The uncooperative behavior not only of the citizens of Thessaloniki, but also of Athens, Naupaktos, Corfu, and Himara led them to be damned from the pulpit more than once as irredeemably wicked. But the economic forces in operation, which were beyond any individual's control, could not be halted by means of sermons. The position of bishops as the primary stewards of wealth and of modalities of giving began to erode. The brutal binary model in which the rich faced the poor across a chasm with no group in between, and only the splendidly isolated figure of the bishop acting as a bridge, no longer applied with the rise of a middle class, the so-called messi. With time, alternative safety nets and forms of solidarity dominated in cities, and new public expressions of religious piety emerged, as provincial society continued to settle into the new patterns of land use, manufacturing, and trade. These expressions of civic cohesion and regional patriotism were focused on the activities of the religious confraternity, the professional guild, and, above all, the political assembly, the Vuli, and the Ecclesia του Δήμου. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I particularly like the graffito on the Parthenon.
I don't think it's there anymore. I think we've lost it, but it was there once.
Do we have questions from the audience? If not, I'll read one here from Kathy Dobra. She says, hello, Dr. Shawcross. In these ecclesiastical courts, were the bishops able to assert greater authority than the emperor's administration because of their greater religious authority, or did they potentially have more guards/soldiers locally to enforce any legal rulings?
That's an interesting question. I'm not aware of bishops keeping private armies, though it's certainly something to look into. They do have a household that they bring with them that does include secular individuals. But I'm not aware, for instance, of the recruitment of mercenaries or raising armies privately within the region.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for this extremely interesting talk. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
No, it's about the same topic. I'm wondering whether there are texts where you see this tension between imperial authority as expressed in provincial justice and ecclesiastical justice. I mean, because you're describing that this period later, 12th, early 13th, as a period of, I will take this off, as a period during which imperial justice recedes in the provinces, and it's like a triumph of the church, as if the state wanted to keep it like this. I don't know, I'm just thinking. Is this clear? I don't know. Yes.
I think it is. You're asking me whether we have specific texts that show the competition or interaction between the civil administration and the ecclesiastical administration locally, and also whether the imperial presence does actually recede in the provinces.
Yes, and whether this is like a triumph of the church, in a triumph of the church, or a victory?
I think it is. That's not to say that bishops haven't been active for a millennium in their local sees. Paradoxically, I think what one is seeing in the 11th century is greater presence of the civil administration. Higher levels of taxation, as I explained, and there's a reaction to that that coalesces around the figure of the bishop, who is able through that to advance his authority. In terms of specific texts, we mainly have the story told from the point of view of the bishops. That is true. We have records from the civil administration from the provinces, but not necessarily orations, speeches. These tend to survive from bishops. And they do show a complicated interaction with representatives of the civil administration. In other words, those representatives can be welcomed, they can be approached for favors, they can be treated well by the bishop, But at some point that can flip. One example would be the way in which Choniates writes. He writes a welcome for one of the main civic officials, the governor of the region, at the same time as he's pursuing a case in Constantinople to have that governor barred from the city. So it's a complicated scenario. We also see bishops marrying into the local nobility, secular nobility. Not the bishops themselves, but their family marrying into the local nobility. So Choniates marries various nephews, nieces, to local noble families. And those families in turn do have ties to the capital and often send members who rise within the central hierarchy. So it is a complicated picture, and certainly it's not clear-cut. But generally speaking, I think one can see the accrual of power by the bishop in this period.
Thanks so much for the talk. Do we see local property being, or local wealth being devoted towards or divested towards local charity as a means of removing it from imperial state power as a way of protecting local wealth?
This is certainly not unusual. The foundation of monasteries as ways of fencing off wealth and protecting it from the fisc happens quite a lot. These monasteries are often also used as retirement homes for members of the nobility, local notables who are wealthy. And so it's a way of protecting oneself. All political careers end in disaster. And these monasteries provide a safe house, so to speak. So absolutely, yes.
So thank you, Teresa. I just wanted to ask sort of the longer picture too, sort of what happens in the 12th and 13th centuries and with this middle class also, and is it sort of demonstrable in terms of institutions? I mean, could we see things like education and schools or church, hospitals, for example? I mean, is there sort of a ebb or flow, or, you know, of these kinds of things that actually support a middle class? I don't know.
Right. We certainly see or at least there's more evidence of things like religious confraternities, associations of local people within cities that are active both in dispensing charity within their neighborhood and also in protecting themselves in terms of burial, masses after their death, these kinds of things. We also do seem to see a rise in literacy in this period. So by the 13th century, for instance, there are suggestions that about 70% of the male population is functionally literate. Perhaps on a very basic level, but that's pretty high for the medieval period. So there do seem to be shifts. We can't see them very well, and that's got to do with the fact that archives haven't survived from cities. The archives we tend to have are from monastic foundations or incorporated in manuscripts, in texts from the imperial capital, for instance. So the picture isn't as clear as we'd like it to be, but there are hints there, certainly. And the fact we have references to Evuli and Ecclesia to Dimou as standing institutions in cities like Thessaloniki suggests that there are real changes occurring.
Thank you for this great talk. I have a related question. Namely, you alluded to the emergence in this period of new wealth and new rich based on commercial activity. And I wanted to ask you if you see any traces of this new group in the corpora you surveyed. I mean, Apokavkos, Evstathios, Choniatis, and Chomatinos. do they emerge as a kind of a distinctive group with new habits, etc.? Or do they remain invisible?
The language of the bishops tends to be extremely conservative, and we don't see them referring to the Messi as a social group in the late 12th, early 13th century. For that kind of language, we have to look further into the 13th century and early 14th. Though that said, if we turn away from the bishop's own language and we started looking at mercantile transactions and resolution of conflict in that area, of course, we see lots of new terms, neologisms appearing in the record. It's not clear to me that the bishops know what vocabulary to use for this group, or indeed that they want to acknowledge its existence, because it does pose a direct threat to them.
I was wondering if there is an opportunity for people appealing for justice from the bishop to appeal to provincial, civic, or imperial authorities if they didn't get a favorable ruling, and if so, do we see this scenario in the sources? Thank you.
We only see the opposite in the sources. I'm assuming it did happen, or that indeed there would be joint rulings. And this seems to be evident in the sources from Epirus, that both parties agree on a ruling, and it's usually the church that carries out the moral punishment and the secular administration that imposes other forms of punishment. So one does see them cooperating in some cases. But Epirus is a bit of an exceptional case because we're dealing with a period when it's already become separate to some extent from the empire. And the civil administration in place is actually run by a local strongman. So one of the local nobility, which is not quite the same thing as an imperial administration, even though he does go on to claim the title of emperor for himself.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was curious about what you ended on when you mentioned the vuli and the ecclesia of the demos. In polis studies, we're ever more appreciating the continuation of the polis beyond the classical period into the Hellenistic and the Roman. And I'm now really interested for these cities where we see the vuli and the ecclesia rising again. Are these cities where there is a unbroken civic tradition back to antiquity, or is this was there memory of that and now there's a revival?
I think this is a very conscious revival of terminology. Thessaloniki is the center of a cultural renaissance that involves going back to ancient sources, ancient texts, and using ancient political theory in order to talk about contemporary realities. And it's very much a program that evolves over several decades, over a century, very precise in its elaboration, and very keen on using this old terminology and co-opting the prestige attached to that terminology. So I don't think we're dealing necessarily with continuity here.
Here on the chat from Eric Driscoll. Hi, Eric, from Athens. He says he was wondering if there was any gap between the bishop's rhetorical position that they, rather than the emperors, ought to control some local revenue streams in order to benefit their local poor, and the reality of what those revenues were spent on, and more simply, whether the local church administration was in fact as destitute as their rhetoric suggested. In the Naupactian case from the start of the lecture, for instance. Thank you.
It's an interesting question. To what extent does the bishop's rhetoric reflect reality? What are revenues really being used for? I'm trying here not to I'm trying to show empathy and not to fall into a position where one is either arguing a rather cynical point of view that this is all bluster on the part of bishops trying to cover their tracts, or alternatively, I'm not trying to defend them either. There's pretty good evidence on the ground, coming mainly from inscriptions from Greece, showing that bishops aren't just running courts, they're also building defenses, funding bridges, doing all this basic infrastructure that the state was responsible for earlier. And so it's not just, if that's the right word, care of the poor. They're taking over other functions of the state in this period. Certainly one can see this already in the 12th century. Whether they are correct in saying that the imperial administration is doing nothing helpful to local communities, that's probably an overstatement. But as I said, the only records we have from the central administration are fiscal records. We don't have that much in terms of, shall we say, soup kitchens, these kinds of activities locally. Yes, there are big hospitals, poorhouses, and so on and so forth set up in Constantinople by the imperial family, but there's much less of this in evidence in the provinces.
Thank you.
I think there is comparative evidence from late antiquity that in early 6th century in Antioch, and the source is Severus of Antioch, the church was in debt, and they took loans and they had to pay them back because they could not feed the poor. So, and I don't think that homily is rhetorical. It depicts the situation, and also there is a concept that the poor are entitled to aid. And so there is this scene that the bishop is away and nobody gives them their due, which was, I don't know, 1 obol per day, per month, I cannot remember, per day. And they were protesting because their bishop was away. And I think in contrast to what we tend to think, there is a notion of entitlement of the poor de facto. Maybe it's not articulated as such. And the opposite, there is also a sense of obligation of the rich to help, I think. But we don't perceive it, we don't formulate it many times as the researchers, as such. Okay, this is my impression at least, and thank you for that.
It's certainly a well-established language and a requirement that a bishop should do this, that the local community should do this. The poor, it's a legal category as much as anything, and involves particular groups within society who are identified as being deserving of this special treatment. So I think that's important. Whether protestations of poverty on the part of bishops reflects reality or not, probably not quite, or not always, but it's very difficult to tell.
I don't see any more questions out there or actually online, but there's certainly congratulations here for a fascinating lecture. I want to thank the audience for your great questions and also for the people who tuned in online. So now I invite you downstairs for a small reception, those of you who are here, and good night to those online. And thank you once again. Lisa,